Hello, my dear children. Hope you are doing good. So, today in this video, we'll be going through reading and explanation of the chapter Feathered Friend. So, let's begin. To the best of my knowledge, there's never been a rule that forbids one to keep pets in a space station. Forbids means to not allow something. No one ever thought it was necessary, and even had such rule existed, I'm quite certain that Sven Olsen would have ignored it. So the narrator starts his story by telling us that, as far as he knows, there was no such rule to not allow someone to keep pets in a space station, as it seemed unnecessary to mention this rule, because you see, no one can think of taking their pets to a space station where there is no oxygen, no gravity, and also one has to arrange food for their pets, and so no one thought of this rule to mention. Then the narrator says that even if such a rule existed, he was quite sure that one of his colleague, whose name was Sven Olsen, would have ignored it. With a name like that, you will picture Sven at once as a 6 foot 6 Nordic giant. Nordic is a term that is used for people who are connected with northern European countries, who are tall, heavy, having blue eyes and fair hair, built like a bull and with a voice to match. Had this been so, his chances of getting a job in space would have been very slim. Here, the term slim is used to tell that his chances of getting job would be very small if he had such strong physique. Actually, he was a wiry little fellow, like most of the early spaces. Wiry means thin but strong, and spaces means people who work in space. So, narrator describes his colleague Sven Olsen by saying that with a name like that, anyone would picture him as a 6 feet 6 inches tall Nordic person having a very strong physique like that of a bull and had a strong voice matching to his personality. But the narrator added that he would never get a job in space with such strong personality, because you see, spacecrafts had size restrictions for their inhabitants. So actually he was a thin but a strong person, like most of the early spacers. Sven was one of our best construction men. He excelled at tricky and specialized work of collecting girders as they floated around, making them do the slow motion three-dimensional ballet that would get them into the right position. So here, excelled means to be very good at doing something. And then girders are long, thin pieces of metal that are used in constructing bridges and in construction works. You can see this is the picture of girders. You can get an idea how girders look like with this picture. My dear children, ballet is a form of dance, and here narrator compared floating girders to a form of dance which is called ballet, because objects in space float around instead of staying fixed on the ground. So the movement of the floating girders seemed as if they were dancing. Then he would fuse the pieces together when they were precisely fitted into the correct pattern. Precisely means exactly. It was a skilled and difficult job, for a spacesuit is not the most convenient of clothes in which to work. However, Swen's team had one great advantage over the construction gangs you see putting up skyscrapers down on earth. Skyscrapers means an extremely tall building. They could step back and admire their work without being abruptly parted from it by gravity. Abruptly means sudden and unexpected. So here narrator tells that Sven was one of their best construction men. He was very good in doing tricky and specialized work of collecting floating girders, put them right into position, and then joined those girders together when they were exactly fitted into correct pattern. It was a very difficult task, as all these works they had to do in spacesuit, which was not convenient enough for construction workers. Swen's team had got one great advantage over the constructors working on Earth, as they can just float around to look and appreciate their work without getting separated by from their work due to gravity, unlike those constructors on Earth who built extremely tall buildings and had to put their energy and effort to look around their work. Don't ask me why Sven wanted a pet or why he chose the one he did. I'm not a psychologist, but I must admit that his selection was very sensible. Claribel weighed practically nothing, her food requirements were tiny, and she was not worried, as most animals would have been, by the absence of gravity. Here, narrator says that he couldn't tell why Sven wanted a pet or why he chose a canary as his pet, as he was not a psychologist. But he admitted that Sven's selection of keeping canary as a pet was very sensible, as she was very lightweighted, her food requirements were very tiny, and was least worried by the absence of gravity, as she was a bird and had habit of being in air. I first became aware that Claribel was a bird. A bird means on or onto the train, ship, or any aircraft. I was sitting in the little cubbyhole, laughingly called my office, when I heard the musical whistle beside my ear. I assumed that it had come over the station intercom. Intercom, as I told you in previous video, is a two-way communication system with a microphone and a loudspeaker at offices, planes, or stations, etc. It didn't. Instead, there was a long and complicated pattern of melody that made me look up with such a start that I forgot all about the board just behind my head. When the stars had ceased to explode before my eyes, I had my first view of Claribel. So, narrator came to know that Claribel, Sven's canary pet, was on the space station when he was sitting in his small office of space station, and he heard a musical whistle beside his ear, which he thought had come over the intercom for some instruction, or and so he waited for the announcement to follow. But then he realized that the voice was not from the intercom. Instead, it was a long and complicated pattern of melody that came from somewhere else. Then the narrator, out of curiosity, forgot that just behind his head there was a board, and as soon as he looked up to search where that melody came from, he got his head bumped into the board and hurt his head. Stars exploded before his eyes, but when he gained consciousness, he had his first encounter with Claribel, and he understood that the melody came from her. She was a small yellow canary, hanging in the air as motionless as a hummingbird. Motionless means at rest or not moving, and with much less effort, for her wings were quietly folded along her sides. We stared at each other for a minute. Before I had recovered my wits, she did a kind of backward loop. Loop means a coiled shape. She moved backward in coiled shape. I'm sure no earthbound canary, earthbound means restricted to earth, the canaries who are on earth, had ever managed. Then she departed with a few unhurried flicks. Unhurried means moving slowly or not in hurry. Flicks means quick and sudden movements. It was quite obvious that she had already learned how to operate in the absence of gravity and did not believe in doing unnecessary work. So now, after narrator had his first view of Claribel, he describes her as a small yellow canary bird who was hanging in air as motionless as hummingbird. Narrator compared Claribel's movement with hummingbird because hummingbirds can stay still in air for longer time. You can see this small footage of hummingbird in air. Her wings were folded along her sides because there in space everything floats due to lack of gravity, and Claribel had to make no efforts to float there. Both Claribel and narrator stared at each other for over a minute, and before narrator came out of shock of seeing a bird in space station, she moved backward making coiled shaped movement. By then, narrator was quite sure that no canary on earth could have managed their movement that way. It became quite obvious to narrator that she had already learned how to deal with the movements in space in the absence of gravity. Sven didn't confess to her ownership for several days. By that time, it no longer mattered because Claribel was a general pet. He had smuggled her up on the last ferry from Earth when he came back from leave. So, smuggled or to import or export a person or thing secretly into or out of a place contrary to the law. Ferry is a boat that carries people or goods or other vehicles across the river. Partly, he claimed, out of sheer scientific curiosity, he wanted to see just how a bird would operate when it had no weight but could still use its wings. So Sven didn't confess that he was the owner of Claribel for longer period of time, and it didn't matter to other spaces also because by that time Claribel became a general pet for them. Narrator tells that Sven had brought Claribel secretly on a boat when he came back to work from his holidays and claimed that he was curious to see just how a bird would manage her wings in flight in no gravity. So, my dear children, I hope you are clear with the explanation of the story till now. Rest of the reading and explanation of the chapter we'll do in next video. Thank you.